We have another exciting and stimulating panel before us now, a panel that looks at modern social paradigms and the Hizmet movement. It's chaired by the eminent Professor Dick Simpson, and I was asked to just make one program note that Professor Simpson might have thought of making himself. I'm going to make it for him, and then he can proceed to introduce the panel. And that is that Professor Leonid Sikianin, I don't know, I probably have not pronounced his name correctly, was not able to join us from Russia. And so Professor Tom Boyd from the University of Oklahoma has generously agreed to read Professor Sikianin's paper, okay? So that's the one alteration in the program as you have it in your booklets. And now I give the floor to Professor Simpson.
Yes, well, I am the evil enforcer, and there will be a strict 20-minute time limit on the speakers, and I have these very nice flags that I will start at the 5-minute moment. As the speakers are there, I invite them to look this direction and to see them. We have very important panelists today talking about very important topics, but perhaps the best exchange will be in your questions. So I shall keep my introductions very brief and move us as quickly as possible to this important question, which is, what is the relationship between the theoretical basis or the foundational basis of the Gülen movement and the actual practice of the Hizmet movement as it works out in practice? And how does it react with modern concepts, in a more general term than our last speakers used, of multiculturalism, globalization, democratic reform, and civility? How do these come into play with the Hizmet movement? Our first speaker is Simon Robinson from Leeds Metropolitan University in the United Kingdom. He is Professor of Applied and Professional Ethics at Leeds Metropolitan University, also part of the Church of England, and is going to present his paper on multiculturalism and the ethics of diversity.
Chair, my lateral vision isn't very good, so I may not see your yellows or your reds. So I'll need a cough or perhaps even a gunshot.
The black is, however, very
okay. It's a great joy to be here in this wonderful city and this great university. It is indeed a great university. My last time in Chicago was in 2003 when I was running the marathon here. And it was a fascinating experience. Flat as a pancake, wonderful, wonderful. Possibly if you forgive me, any Bostonians or New Yorkers here, Chicago is the best marathon. That is for sure. That is for sure. I ran it with my UK colleague, Paula Radcliffe, the champion runner, and in the final mile, I was certainly catching her. Oh, okay, she was an hour and a half ahead of me, but I was gaining on her, that's for sure. The other crucial thing about Chicago is the tremendous culture, the architecture, and right at the moment there is a wonderful example of this culture playing at the Lyric Opera in Chicago, the combination of Britain and Shakespeare in Midsummer Night's Dream. If you haven't seen that, I urge you go and see it. It's a world-class performance, quite superb. Mostly Americans playing the parts, but there's a British bottom, and that's very important. Very, very important. Indeed, yes. And in a way, the Midsummer Night's Dream is a little bit like this whole issue of multiculturalism. It's a good illustration of multiculturalism. There you have a world which is indeed multicultural, populated by the rude mechanicals, the artisans, class leaders, the law of Athens, lovers and would-be lovers in conflict with family and culture, and fairies in conflict with each other and everybody else. And Shakespeare provides a space where all these meet to reflect upon imagination, culture, meaning, and hope, mediated by laws of different kinds. There's a space, well, actually there's no space there for real resolution. And I'm not sure that resolution is a key to that play, because after all, the resolution occurs in Act 4, and then there's another Act 5 that is the final conclusion. At the completion of the Act 5, we hear those immortal words of Robin Goodfellow: "If we shadows have offended, think but this and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here, while these visions did appear. And this weak and idle theme, no more yielding but a dream." The invitation to put all the conflict and tension to one side, "It's only a dream," he says, is of course the ultimate irony of the play. Far from being a dream, this is how we are, having to deal with difference in all its ambiguity and frustration and difficulties, and that's what's central to our human experience. And we're not very good at this, of course. Hence Goodfellow's more realistic comment in Act 3, "Lord, what fools we mortals be." In this paper, I won't go into it in detail. I'll give you the general argument, and so hopefully end on time. Basically, what I want to argue is that this notion of multiculturalism is the fact that we have to deal with. The paradigm so often in Europe of multiculturalism is the idea of some kind of value idea. We need to recognize, value, and give space to all the difference, as if that by itself is good enough, as it were. In the first part of my paper, I try and argue that, in fact, that's not good enough. And I illustrate that in the case of the head of my church's, the Archbishop of Canterbury's arguments about Sharia law, which are very good, but don't actually go beyond accommodating difference. The second part of the paper moves into the notion of what Gülen has to contribute to this, which I would argue brings alongside rights responsibility. And once you're into responsibility, that's when you're into a really exciting view of multiculturalism, an interactive view of multiculturalism. The third part of the paper, which I'll ditch today, is about ethics, but we already have a good ethicist, so he can talk about ethics in his paper in the final paper. That first part, this was the occasion 2 or 3 years ago when Williams, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, suggested that there may be a good reason for accommodating Sharia law formally within English law. As you might expect, this severely frightened the horses in the UK. And all kinds of headlines. But actually, Rowan, when he was producing this argument, was focusing on not so much the imposition of Sharia law, but upon good Enlightenment principles. He wanted to see Sharia law very much in the light of the suggestions of the previous chair, as something that could be part of imaginative conversation. For him, Enlightenment principles are about having a critical conversation, the adventure of an unrehearsed critical conversation, as Oakeshott says of higher education. The problem about Rowan's approach to this is that, on the one hand, simply to accommodate the Sharia law is very difficult within a legal framework. Barno looked at this, and in her research was quite clear that actually the majority of Muslims that she talked to did not want that kind of accommodation. They didn't want a formal framework. They didn't want that kind of acknowledgement of difference. They preferred to maintain an informality in that kind of approach. And there were lots of arguments. The women that she spoke to argued vociferously that they felt that if you accommodated this formally into UK law, there could be abuses of power, all the kind of arguments that we would want to put forward. And Williams was aware of this, therefore he wanted to have a framework of responsibility that would be there, making those who actually administered Sharia law accountable to each other and to the wider law in some way. And that was okay as far as it went. But his view of responsibility was limited. So my argument is that he certainly wanted to get into the conversation, and he certainly wanted to move into some sense of accountability to law and to each other, But he missed the third element of responsibility. In an Aristotelian approach and in further developments on responsibility, there tend to be three levels, interactive levels of responsibility. One is the idea of agency. I am responsible for what I think and for the effects that I have upon others and upon the world. Secondly, the idea of accountability. I am accountable to certain people, stakeholders or whatever, and therefore I need to have the capacity to give an account of my thinking and my actions. But thirdly, a much wider notion of responsibility, and that's the idea of liability. This is the idea of shared responsibility with others for what we have, our community, our environment, and so forth. And one of the problems I want to argue with William's approach is that, in fact, he missed that out. And therefore, the core of his argument was all about accommodating difference, not actually looking at how difference can work together in shared responsibility, and how difference in that situation was, and is, I would argue, critical to any response in terms of society, any notion of multiculturalism. How are we doing for time? What's the...
You're doing good, 10 minutes.
Oh, good, excellent, good.
8 to be exact.
8, okay, right. Yeah. Excellent, thank you. I've got time, therefore, to move into what I take to be Gülen's contribution to this. Gülen has a strong sense throughout his writing of responsibility, and it's a fascinating area. You can see how his thinking about responsibility has elements of Aristotelian thought. You can see how elements of it even move into sort of possibly existential. You know, I must take responsibility for my being and my response, and certainly elements of it move into that dreadful notion of postmodernity. I'm not going to define postmodernity. I'm not sure if it exists. Let's forget about those kind of terms just for the time being. But I want to argue that actually that notion of responsibility sits at the heart of a model of multiculturalism which I think he has to offer to society. The first part of that has an accountability which is directly faced towards God. So the individual and the Islamic world are responsible to God. This is based in creation theology, and clearly, as we've heard throughout the conference, this establishes this notion of vicegerency. It is up to us to give an account in action to God and in thinking to God. From that, he moves into a strong sense of that notion of responsibility as agency. Agency for us Westerners, for Westerners, sorry, forgive me, is so often seen as an individualistic thing, and so often seen as based around freedom. And so we often have the Isaiah Berlin distinction between freedom from or freedom to. You are free, you are an agent insofar as that you are free from oppression, you are an agent insofar as you are free to do something. Gülen takes it much further than that. A step on from that would be freedom to do your duty. Michael Novak. Does Michael Novak still operate in the US? Yeah, he does, yes. Was that an approving or a disapproving? It was a disapproving well, there you go. Gülen takes it beyond that. And this is something about freedom to create. Because if you're into creation theology and you have to respond to the impetus of God's creation, then you are about the freedom to create. It's a much richer notion of agency. But then he moves on wonderfully to this notion of liability, and I want to focus on that for a little bit. How's the timing? Fine. Oh gosh. I'll briefly point out. Basically, it seems to me this notion of universal responsibility is where Gülen joins hands with an awful lot of these postmodern thinkers, from Levinas to Bauman and all these characters. The notion that we have to act as if we are responsible for everything and everybody, past, present, and future. an extraordinary thought. I mentioned that in a lecture to the European Business Ethics Network, actually in Turkey 3 years ago, and the response was a mystification. How can business people be responsible for everything in the past, the present, and the future? We had a good conversation. It was mostly American academics who couldn't cope with this, which was interesting. But he focused on on that core notion of universal responsibility. As that develops, this is quite clearly based in the notion of being responsible in fact. We've heard this before, the notion that there is a spirituality at the core of Gülen, which is cognitive, affective, and somatic, and social. We want to see what it means. His spirituality is about seeing what the difference is. It's not about just knowing the idea of it, it's seeing the difference. And clearly that demands that we work together toward that. I can see it. The working together, thank you so much. The working together towards that. I want to suggest, in several of the contributions so far, we've heard the term hope. Well, I think certainly that's at the core of what Gülen is talking about. Schneider, when he talks about hope, suggests that hope, well, first of all, is a virtue. It's what we bring to the table. It's not just some idea. It's a real thing about us, the capacity to hope and to envision the future in a creative and clear and possible way. And Schneider suggests it involves purpose, knowing your purpose, reflecting on the purpose, back to Aristotle. It involves pathways, finding the pathways. It involves agency, as I mentioned, and it involves support. And those three ways of hope are clearly exemplified in Gülen's theology and in the movement which he puts forward. I want to suggest that gives us a really interesting approach to ethics, but I won't go into that just now. What I want to conclude in is that I believe this gives us a really exciting model for multiculturalism that can work, where difference is not just about valuing the other as different, but actually valuing the other as co-creator, where difference is necessary for that co-creation. Absolutely necessary to have different perspectives, different talents, different knowledge, and knowledges go back to the intellectual virtues of Aristotle.
Thank you, Simon.
Okay, just one more minute, okay? My final conclusion, okay? If I can find it. There it is, yes. It's a good conclusion, I promise you. Yeah. At the core of this is something about co-creation and shared responsibility, and those in different positions reflecting on meaning and developing identity and developing an imagination big enough to respond to the imperative to act. And this brings us back to Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. Theseus has little time for the imagination, seeing this as the world of the lunatic, the lover, and the poet. But Shakespeare knows that the imagination gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name, a place and an identity. And that's what the core notion of responsibility in Gülen gives in thought and in practice. Thank you.
Thank you.